السابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So last time then we were in the book of fasting, and in particular the chapter regarding the Taraweeh prayer and Itikaaf, and we had just discussed the narration of Aisha radiyallahu anha, where she had mentioned in kana Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam la yudkhilu alayya ra'sah wa huwa fil masjid fa urajjiluh وكان لا يدخل البيت إلا لحاجة إذا كان معتكفا متفق عليه واللفظ للبخاري. That the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to bring his head in to the home, because the home of Aisha was connected to Al-Masjid al-Nabawi. And so through the window he would bring his head in whilst he was in the masjid. And so she would comb his hair and fix his hair. And he would not enter the home unless there was a necessity or a need when he was in i'tikaf. So this hadith had shown us that when a person is in i'tikaf, it is not permissible for him, it is not something correct for him to exit from the masjid unless there is a necessity or a need. For example, if there were no facilities to answer the call of nature except that you leave the masjid and go somewhere, then you leave and go and then come back. Or if you're in i'tikaf and there is no one to bring you any food, even though these days the way the mosques are and the numbers of people, usually that would be arranged, but supposing you had no one to bring you any food when you're in i'tikaf, then it would be permissible for you to go out to get some food for yourself, for the iftar, for the suhoor. The point being, you are only supposed to exit from the masjid when you're in i'tikaf if there is an absolute necessity to do so. Not like some people, they go into i'tikaf, they make the intention for the 10 days, but then every evening or just before Maghrib, they leave and go home to have a shower, freshen up and come back again for the night. You cannot make your i'tikaf intention for 10 days and then leave every day to relax at home for a while and to eat and come back. Or maybe they go home after Maghrib to have the iftar at home and relax and then come back for the Taraweeh and then carry on the i'tikaf. That is not the way. The one who makes the intention to do the i'tikaf, then you remain in the masjid unless there is a necessity to exit. In the next narration also of Aisha radiyallahu anha, she says, السنة على المعتكف ألا يعود مريضا ولا يشهد جنازة ولا يمس امرأة ولا يباشرها ولا يخرج لحاجة إلا لما لا بد له منه ولا اعتكاف إلا بصوم ولا اعتكاف إلا في مسجد جامع. رواه أبو داود ولا بأس برجاله إلا أن الراجح وقف آخره. In this narration now also of Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that the sunnah for the person doing i'tikaf is that he is not to go out to visit somebody ill. Normally the sunnah is, if somebody is ill, to go and visit them. But in this narration it says the sunnah for somebody in i'tikaf is not to leave and go to visit someone who's ill. وَلَا يَشْهَدَ جَنَازَةً, and neither to go and witness and participate outside in a janazah burial. Normally the sunnah is to go and do so. But for the one in i'tikaf, not to do so, not to go out of the masjid. Of course, in the masjid, if the janazah prayer is held there, then he prays. But not to follow the procession into the burial outside of the mosque. وَلَا يَمَسَّ امْرَأَةً, and neither is he to touch a woman. وَلَا يُبَاشِرَهَا, and neither to become intimate physically with a woman. وَلَا يَخْرُجُ لِحَاجَةٍ إِلَّا لِمَا لَا بُدَّ لَهُ مِنْهُ, and that person is not to exit for any need unless it was something that's an absolute necessity. And then at the end it also says that there is no i'tikaf unless the person is fasting too. And there is no i'tikaf except in a masjid jami', meaning a large mosque where all the prayers are established and the Jumu'ah is established, a fully operating masjid. So what does this narration tell us? Firstly, the obvious, that the person in i'tikaf is not supposed to leave the masjid. When you make your intention for i'tikaf in the masjid, then your intention is to remain and to stick to the masjid, to free yourself up for the worship of Allah, not to be exiting and entering, exiting and entering. So the one in i'tikaf is not supposed to leave. أن المعتكف لا يخرج من معتكفه حتى ولا إلى العبادات المستحبة. Not even for acts of worship that are mustahab and sunnah normally, like going to visit somebody who's ill, or following the funeral until the burial into the graveyard. Not even for those reasons does the person exit from the masjid, the one who has made the intention of i'tikaf in the mosque. ولا يخرج من المسجد إلى بيته نعم كعيادة المريض وشهود الجنازة. هذه عبادات مستحبة فيها فضل عظيم، لكن ما هو فيه من العبادة أفضل. So going to visit somebody who's ill, or going and following the funeral procession, all of those are great acts of worship and there are rewards within them. But this person who's in i'tikaf is currently in an act of worship that is greater than those. This is an act of worship that is greater than the act of worship in visiting somebody ill for the sake of Allah, or from the act of worship of following the funeral and to the burial. This act of worship he is in right now, in doing i'tikaf in the masjid, is superior. And so he does not break that and leave to participate in other actions. فلا يخرج من أجل تحصيل هذه السنن لأنه في سنة أعظم وهو الاعتكاف. So the person cannot exit to go and perform these sunnah acts of worship, visiting the ill, going to the burial, janazah. He doesn't go out to fulfill those actions of sunnah, because he is right now in an action of sunnah that is superior to them. I'tikaf is superior to them. And also, the narration tells us further, as well as not exiting from the masjid, that a person is not to engage in intimacy. When a person is in i'tikaf, then he is not to engage in intimacy. So he cannot touch a woman, he cannot engage in physical intimacy with a woman. And this is indicated in the Quran. We have been told in the Quran that this action of intimacy of that nature of a man engaging in that, leaving to engage in that, is impermissible. In the Quran, Allah tells us regarding the ones who are doing i'tikaf, وَلَا تُبَاشِرُوهُنَّ وَأَنْتُمْ عَاكِفُونَ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ. Do not engage in the foreplay, the physical intimacy, or any form of intimacy. Do not engage in that, and you are doing i'tikaf. Whilst you are doing i'tikaf, do not engage in that intimacy. فَلَا يَمَسَّهَا بِيَدِهِ لِأَنَّ هَذَا يُحَرِّكُ شَهْوَةً. So you do not touch any woman whilst you're in i'tikaf, because that will obviously arouse the desire. وَهُوَ وَسِيلَةٌ إِلَى الْمُبَاشَرَةِ فَنُهِيَ عَنِ الْوَسِيلَةِ. So that is a means to lead to the foreplay, and so these means are prohibited. So it is impermissible for a person who's made that intention to do i'tikaf for 5 days, 10 days, whatever the period he can do, for him to exit during that period to engage in intimacy or intercourse. If a person made the intention he's doing i'tikaf for 10 days, and then after a few days he exits for a short time back to his house and engages in intercourse, then his i'tikaf is broken. That i'tikaf that he's doing, the intention he had made for the 10 days, that is now invalidated. If he was to exit and have intercourse, for example, because Allah has told us, لا تباشروهن وأنتم عاكفون في المساجد. Do not engage in the foreplay and thereafter intercourse whilst you are doing i'tikaf in the mosques. فيتجنب النساء فيتجنب المس باليد أو المباشرة. So that person has to avoid any physical contact with any woman, with his wife, etc., or touching, has to avoid these affairs whilst he is in the worship of i'tikaf. Those points are clear. Then there is a section at the end of the hadith which is actually disputed by the scholars. And some of them say that this final section where Aisha says, and you cannot do i'tikaf unless you are fasting, and you cannot do i'tikaf unless it's in a large mosque, a fully organized and operating masjid. That line at the end with those two clauses, those two conditions, some of the scholars, they say that is not actually part of the hadith, but that extra line was from Aisha radiallahu anha herself. Some scholars have mentioned that, because there is a dispute over those affairs. Firstly, the issue of the Masjid Jami'. Sometimes you get mosques where the prayers are being established. Come forward. You get sometimes mosques where prayers are being established. Dhuhr, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha. The 5 prayers are being established every day. But maybe there is no Jum'ah in that mosque. Maybe there is no Jum'ah that gets done in that mosque. Maybe it's a small mosque, the 10 or 20 people who come there during the week. For the Jum'ah, half a mile down the road or a mile down the road, there's a big mosque. All the community always goes to that mosque for the Jum'ah. This small mosque on the side street, whatever, they pray their 5 daily prayers, but they don't do Jum'ah in it. And that's very common in Saudi Arabia. In some of the Arab countries, it's very common that every area, every few streets, there'll be a small mosque. Every few streets, there'll be a small mosque. But then every few streets further on, there'll be a large one. For the 5 daily prayers, all of the little mosques in every few streets pray the 5 daily prayers. But the Jum'ah, those little mosques everywhere, they don't do it. Everybody goes to the central mosque of the area. So the point here and what the scholars have said is, if you're going to do i'tikaf, it would not be allowed for you to do i'tikaf in one of the small side street mosques. You'd have to go to the main one in that block. Because if you do it in the small one, okay, your 5 daily prayers are established, but the Jum'ah, what are you going to do? You would have no choice but to exit and go out onto the streets and go to that other masjid to pray and then come back. So that's why it's not permissible to do i'tikaf in a mosque that is not, you could say, fully operational with all of the prayers and the Jum'ah and everything being done. Here sometimes you get some of these university mosques. Maybe sometimes there's no Fajr prayer, nobody turns up. No students are there obviously. And maybe it's just Dhuhr, Asr, maybe Maghrib, and maybe even Isha in the summer months, it doesn't get opened up. So that kind of mosque, you wouldn't be able to do i'tikaf in it. You have to do i'tikaf in a fully operating masjid, meaning all of the 5 daily prayers, the Jum'ah prayers, the Adhan, everything is fully operational in that masjid. That's what it means by Masjidun Jami'un. But like they say, some of the scholars, this section is extra, but there isn't much debate about that. That section about the mosque having to be a fully operational masjid, there isn't really any debate on that. All of the scholars, they mention that, because obviously if you do i'tikaf in a smaller masjid where Jum'ah isn't happening, for example, or the Fajr Jama'ah doesn't take place, then in those situations, especially Jum'ah, you'd have to leave. So that isn't an issue. But the other part of the statement, that's where there is a lot of debate. The other part of the statement was that you can only do i'tikaf if you are fasting. So is that actually a condition to do i'tikaf, or is it not? فهذا من باب الأفضلية. Many of the scholars have said that actually it is not a condition for your i'tikaf to be valid that you have to be fasting. Many of the scholars have said it is not a condition for your i'tikaf to be valid that you have to also be fasting. Rather, it is from the virtuousness that it is better, of course, and superior that a person be fasting when he does i'tikaf, because the whole purpose of i'tikaf is to free yourself up for the worship of Allah, and fasting is one of the greatest acts of worship. So for you to be fasting, then you are implementing your purpose of i'tikaf properly. You are doing the acts of worship, including fasting, whilst you're in i'tikaf. So it is far superior and far better that a person who's in i'tikaf should be fasting also. But it's not a condition for the validity of i'tikaf. So your i'tikaf can still be valid even if you weren't fasting. فَلَوْ اعْتَكَفَ وَهُوَ مُفْطِرْ جَازَ ذَلِكَ. So if a person did do i'tikaf and he's not fasting, it is permissible. وَإِنْ اعْتَكَفَ وَهُوَ صَائِمٌ فَهُوَ أَفْضَلُ. But if he does the i'tikaf whilst fasting, then that is clearly superior. So in that case, the stronger opinion appears to be what the Shaykh mentions there, that it's not a condition, but it is superior. You should be fasting when doing i'tikaf. And remember, i'tikaf isn't necessarily always going to be just in Ramadan. Maybe somebody makes a vow that next month I'm going to go to the masjid and do i'tikaf for a week. I'm going to stay in the mosque, i'tikaf in the mosque. He makes a vow to do it. Okay, so next week he's got to fulfill his vow. There's no haram in that. It's a good thing. Go to the mosque, free yourself up, stay there, do your Quran, your prayers, your dua. But next week is it Ramadan? So that's where this kind of thing comes in more importantly. Next week now, when he goes and fulfills his vow, it will be better for him if he also fasts when doing the i'tikaf, because the whole purpose of the i'tikaf is to free yourself up to do the actions of worship. So now he's free, secluded in the masjid, fasted. At the same time, you're not going out and working and busy and physical and thirsty. You're in the masjid, freeing yourself up for worship. So fast also. And also now then, the narration therefore is summarized into saying that the person who does i'tikaf is not supposed to leave the mosque unless it is an absolute necessity. He's not even supposed to leave for actions that are usually sunnah, like visiting somebody ill or going to the graveyard and the burial and the janazah, not even those things. Because the action he's doing is a sunnah, superior to those sunan. Then on top of that, we also learn that he is not to engage in any form of intimacy during his period of i'tikaf. And we also learn that the i'tikaf, it is better that you be fasting when doing it, but not a condition. And we also learned that the i'tikaf should only be done in a masjid jami', where all of the jama'ah prayers are being established, the Jum'ah is being established, the adhan, it's all being done fully, everything is happening in that masjid, so you wouldn't need to leave. And that is established in the ayah of the Quran too, وَأَنْتُمْ عَاكِفُونَ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ. You must be doing the i'tikaf in those mosques, in the mosques. And that is something we mentioned last time as well, that i'tikaf Islamically is only done in the mosque. Because many women, many sisters, they hear the fatwa from people in Ramadan that in your house, one of the bedrooms or one of the living reception rooms or something, seclude that, put a lock on it, you're going to stay in there, stay there for the 10 days, that's going to be your mu'takaf. In that room, you just stay there. Only exit for the bathroom and other affairs, but otherwise for the 10 days you stay in that room, just like as if you're doing i'tikaf in the mosque. They don't exit from the mosque, you don't exit from that room, unless there's a necessity, the bathroom, etc. So the women then designate a room in their homes, one of the small bedrooms or whatever it is. Nobody else goes in there. They enter that room and they make the intention of i'tikaf and they spend their 10 days there. That is not the Islamic i'tikaf. That is not the Islamic i'tikaf. That is not what these narrations are talking about. Islamically, i'tikaf is only in the mosques. So even if a woman wants to do i'tikaf, she has to do it in the mosque. If she has permission from her husband, if her roles and responsibilities at home are covered, if everything is in place and she's able to go to the masjid and it's secure in the masjid, then yes, she goes to the masjid to do i'tikaf. There's no i'tikaf in this way that some people think the women do it at home in one of the rooms and just seclude themselves there. That isn't the sunnah or the Islamic i'tikaf at all. Then, عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال, that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, ليس على المعتكف صيام إلا أن يجعله على نفسه. رواه الدارقطني والحاكم والراجح وقفه أيضا. In this narration of Ibn Abbas رضي الله عنهما, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, it is not upon the person doing i'tikaf to have to fast. It is not an obligation upon the one doing i'tikaf that they must fast. except if he enforces that upon himself. So this narration basically is exactly the same as the last one. It's not an obligation unless you decide to do so yourself, and we've learned it is better that you decide to do so for yourself. It is superior to be fasting when doing i'tikaf. So the narration is basically saying the same thing and supporting the previous narration of Aisha, that it's not obligatory, but yes, if you decide to do so, then that is superior and better for you to do so. Some of the scholars again have said that this narration is actually the statement of Ibn Abbas himself. Some of the scholars have said that this narration is not a hadith, but actually, in terms of it being from the Prophet, but it's a statement of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma. So it indicates the same thing. It is better to fast when doing i'tikaf, but it's not a condition for the validity of i'tikaf. ولأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اعتكف في شوال لما لم يعتكف العشر الأواخر في رمضان قضاها في شوال، وشوال ليس وقتا للصيام. وأيضا سأله عمر رضي الله عنه أنه نذر في الجاهلية أن يعتكف ليلة في المسجد الحرام فقال له أوفي بنذرك، ومعلوم أن الليل ليس وقتا للصيام، فدل على أن الصيام ليس شرطا للاعتكاف وإنما يكون أفضل من الاعتكاف وهو مفضل. There's a proof, a clear evidence, a clear example which proves that you can do i'tikaf and you're not fasting. It proves clearly that you can do i'tikaf and you don't have to be fasting. And that's the example regarding Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, where he said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that in Jahiliyyah he had made a vow to go and do one night of i'tikaf in al-Masjid al-Haram. One night, from Maghrib to Fajr, one night of i'tikaf in al-Masjid al-Haram. So the Prophet ﷺ told him to fulfill that vow. If you make a vow of obedience, there is no haram in it, then you must fulfill that vow. This is a vow of obedience, to do i'tikaf in the mosque. So Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu told the messenger that he made a vow that he would do one night of i'tikaf in al-Masjid al-Haram. So the Prophet ﷺ told him, fulfill your vow. How is he possibly going to do that i'tikaf with fasting? Is it even possible? It's not. His i'tikaf is from Maghrib to Fajr. Is there any such thing as having your suhoor before Maghrib and then your iftar after Fajr? Opposite way around? It doesn't work. Fasting doesn't occur like that. It's not done like that. So it's known that he would not have fasted doing that i'tikaf when he fulfilled that vow. And the messenger told him, go and fulfill it, knowing that Umar has told him, I vowed to do it at night. The messenger didn't say to him, well, at night it won't be valid because you're not going to be able to fast, so then change it to the day and fulfill your vow like that. If it was a condition for the validity of i'tikaf to be fasting, then it wouldn't have been said to him, yes, go ahead and go fulfill it. The messenger has been told it's at night, and he's told him go and do it, knowing that he's going to have to go and do it without fasting. So this is a proof that it can be done without fasting. But of course, as we said, it is superior that a person be fasting when doing it. Then, عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما أن رجالا من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أروا ليلة القدر في المنام في السبع الأواخر. That some men from the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were shown in a vision, in a dream, that Laylatul Qadr is on the 27th night. This final section of narrations we're going to cover now is about Laylatul Qadr. we did the narrations about Taraweeh, night prayer. We did the narrations about the Itikaaf. And now the narrations about a specific night, the night of decree, Laylatul Qadr, and when that is, and how that is, and the virtues of it. That's the section we're on now. So in this narration of Ibn Umar, he says that some men from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they were shown a dream that Laylatul Qadr is on the 27th. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أرى رؤياكم قد تواطأت في سبع الأواخر, that I see your dream, your vision, what you were shown, it all coincides, all of you, for the 27th. فمن كان متحريا فليتحرها في سبع الأواخر. So whoever is going to look for it, you want to try and catch it, then look for it in the final 7. Firstly, this narration, of course, now about Laylatul Qadr, but at the beginning of the narration, it says, some men from the companions of the Messenger. Do we know who these men were? Their names are not mentioned. We don't know who they were. Some men. So how can this narration be valid and authentic and in Bukhari and Muslim, when we don't even know who this chain of narration is, who these men are in the narration? Some men. Don't know who these men were, what their names were, where they were from. How can the narration be authentic and valid? It's in Bukhari and Muslim. Some men came to the Messenger. But Ibn Umar narrated it about these some men. Ibn Umar is legitimate, but who are the some men?
Is it the fact that's inside the hadith?
Meaning?
Whoever's Muslim was sold in Nabi is one of the companions.
So both of you mean that these men were companions. Whenever you see a narration saying a man from the companions, and then the narration carries on, you don't question it. The companions don't need questioning. It doesn't matter who it was from the companions. We don't need to know their names. Don't confuse this with the chains of narration when you have a majhul. There's somebody in the chain of narration, we don't know who he is. That's a weak chain of narration. It doesn't matter with the companions. You get many narrations where they say, somebody from the companions, he said this or that. That's perfectly okay. Because as long as he was from the companions, it doesn't matter which companion it was, because all of the companions are thiqah. So it doesn't matter which men they were companions. And that is enough to say that they were legitimate thiqat. All of the companions are thiqah. And in this case, they're not even in the chain of narration anyway. This is in the text. But just to make the point. So some of these men, they had this dream that Laylatul Qadr is on the 27th. So the Shaykh says here, مما خص الله به شهر رمضان المبارك وجود ليلة القدر فيه. So one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified Ramadan with is Laylatul Qadr. فليلة القدر هي في شهر رمضان. Laylatul Qadr is somewhere in Ramadan. There are many narrations about Laylatul Qadr and when it is. Is it just the 27th, or is it any of the odd nights, or is it any of the last 10 nights, even the even nights, or is it any of the full 30 nights of Ramadan, or is it even outside of Ramadan? There are many discussions about those things. Of course, what is established then from all of those discussions is that Laylatul Qadr is definitely in the month of Ramadan. That's the most comprehensive way to say it. If you pray every night of Ramadan, then you have caught Laylatul Qadr. Then from all of the 30 nights of Ramadan, the most likely are the last 10. from the last 10, the most likely are the odd nights from the last 10. And then from the odd nights of the last 10, the most likely are, there's different narrations, 21st, 23rd, 25th, 27th. There are different narrations then. So it keeps narrowing down. But if you open it up to the biggest area, then as Shaykh Al-Fawzan says too, open it up to the largest area, to the largest boundary, which is that Laylatul Qadr is somewhere in Ramadan. Pray every night and you definitely caught Laylatul Qadr. But then when you narrow it to the last 10, most likely of course, and then the odd nights, most likely 27th, 25th, you're narrowing it down. If you only pray on the 27th, you may miss it. If you only pray on the odd nights of the last 10, you may still miss it. Even if you pray all 10 of the last 10, you may possibly still miss it, according to what many or some of the scholars have said. So to be certain of the affair, a person prays every night of Ramadan to ensure that he catches Laylatul Qadr. And Allah mentioned, Inna anzalnahu fi Laylatil Qadr. That indeed we sent it down on Laylatul Qadr. Sent what down? The Quran. The beginning of the revelation of the Quran occurred on Laylatul Qadr. And some of the scholars have mentioned the narration about how all of the Quran came down to the other heaven, and then from there it was revealed to the messenger in portions. وَسُمِّيَتْ لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ لِعِظَمِ قَدَرِهَا. One of the reasons why Laylatul Qadr is known as Laylatul Qadr, because one of the meanings of the word Qadr in Arabic is status. And Laylatul Qadr has a great status in Islam. It's high ranking, a great night. And the other reason why it may be known as Laylatul Qadr is because the taqdeer or the qadr, the actual qadr, the decree occurs in that night for that year. Because we know you have the overall decree, everything written in the preserved tablet. And then there is the subdivided within that overall decree, you have your every annual decree. And then that annual decree is the one which is being talked about for Laylatul Qadr. That the annual decree for that year is written on the night of Laylatul Qadr. And of course that is already from the decree in the preserved tablet. It's not a new decree, it is there, but it's the annual decree for that year on Laylatul Qadr. So هذا تقدير خاص مأخوذ من التقدير العام المكتوب في اللوح المحفوظ. فالله جل وعلا وصفها بأنها مباركة. And Allah described Laylatul Qadr as being blessed. وصفها بأنها يفرق فيها كل أمر حكيم. Allah described it that on that night the decree is declared or written. And Allah mentioned إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ. That indeed we revealed it on Laylatul Qadr. Laylatul Qadri khayrun min alfi shahr. Laylatul Qadr, which is better than 1,000 months of worship, which equates to something like 80 years. Alf shahr 80 sana wa ziyada, a little more than 80 years. More than 80 years by some amount is the better than 1,000 months worth of worship. So if a person was to spend that night in worship and he was to catch that night of worship, then indeed he has caught a great amount and a great deal of worship. That is the general introduction to Laylatul Qadr. We'll come to the details next time, inshaAllah. The details of this particular hadith and about this dream that they had, that it's on the 27th. And then there are other narrations coming up as well about when it is and what dua you're supposed to recite and what you're supposed to do on Laylatul Qadr. And then after that, when we finish that section, inshaAllah ta'ala, we'll start with the book of Hajj. Any questions?